Hello there, this is Jay Frost. Welcome to the Frontlines of Social Good, where we bring you the latest news and insights from the world of philanthropy, fundraising, and social impact. On today's episode, we'll begin with a look at the biggest gifts of the week, as we always do, including new investments in global nutrition, higher education, cancer research, and the arts. Then we'll turn to major developments reshaping the nonprofit sector, from the proposed elimination of federal funding for libraries and museums to mounting political pressure on public institutions like the Smithsonian. We'll also unpack the latest fundraising data, which paints a clear picture. Nonprofits are raising more dollars, but from fewer donors. That troubling trend raises important questions about how we build lasting donor relationships and how we can keep our teams strong along the way. In our feature segment, we'll hear from Luis Diaz, founder of the Donor Participation Project and the Annual Fund Toolkit. He'll share some tested strategies on growing donor loyalty in a time when retention is at historic lows. We'll also be joined virtually, in this case, by Evan Wilstein, co-author of the Social Impact Staff Retention Study, to explore what nonprofits can do to better support and retain their people. But first, let's start with this week's top philanthropic gifts. The Bezos family has announced a stunning $500 million challenge grant to UNICEF's Child Nutrition Fund. The initiative aims to tackle child undernutrition in 18 high-burden countries and represents one of the largest family gifts ever made to a global health effort. Coming in number 2 this week, the Weil Family Foundation has committed $50 million to create the Weil Cancer Hub East at Weill Cornell Medicine. The new center will bring together clinicians, researchers, and entrepreneurs to accelerate cancer discoveries and improve care. Number 3, an anonymous donor has given $15 million to the Jacksonville Symphony. This is the largest endowment gift in the orchestra's history and will help to expand artistic programming and community engagement. Number 4, the Robert K. Johnson Foundation has provided $8 million to the University of Pennsylvania to increase access for first-generation and low-income students through enhanced financial aid. And number 5, Carnegie Mellon University has received $8 million from the Posner Foundation of Pittsburgh to establish a rare book library center, safeguarding historic volumes and expanding resources for scholars. And in a bonus gift of the week, the Helmsley Charitable Trust has awarded $6.6 million to the Bar Ilan University to drive breakthroughs in quantum computing and artificial intelligence. Keep watching for that news. In other news, a coalition of 60 civil rights organizations led by the NAACP Legal Defense Fund is urging the U.S. Department of Education to rescind a February directive that threatens federal funding for schools using race-conscious programs. Their Dear Colleague letter orders K through 12 and higher ed institutions to eliminate such practices, citing federal civil rights law. But advocates argue the directive misinterprets the law, threatens equal opportunity, and undermines decades of progress on educational equity. Legal challenges are now underway, and organizations like the ACLU are urging schools to stand firm in support of inclusive practices. The University of Pennsylvania is facing a freeze on over $175 million in federal research funding after the Trump administration issued stop work orders tied to the school's compliance with NCAA rules on transgender athletes. The executive order, Keeping Men Out of Women's Sports, targets schools that allow transgender women to compete in female athletics, referencing Penn swimmer Leah Thomas as a key example. Penn says it followed all applicable rules at the time and is reviewing its legal options. The freeze has disrupted dozens of research projects across the campus. 23 nonprofits have lost over $1.5 billion in USAID funding amid a shift in U.S. foreign aid priorities. Organizations like Catholic Relief Services, FHI 360, and Save the Children are cutting programs, laying off staff, or exiting countries entirely. FHI 360 alone lost more than $600 million in contracts. In Washington, political battles over public history and cultural funding are escalating. President Trump recently signed an executive order titled Restoring Truth and Sanity to American History. the order directs the Smithsonian Institution to eliminate what it calls improper, divisive, or anti-American ideology from museum exhibits. 2 museums were specifically named: the National Museum of African American History and Culture and the American Women's History Museum. The directive claims they promote narratives that, quote, rewrite our nation's history, and tasks Vice President J.D. Vance, as Smithsonian Regent, with overseeing compliance. The Smithsonian strongly rejected the accusations and reaffirmed its commitment to scholarly integrity and inclusive storytelling. Meanwhile, another key cultural agency, the Institute Museum and Library Services, or IMLS, is facing elimination under proposed federal budget cuts. Established in 1996, the IMLS is the largest source of federal funding for libraries and museums. In fiscal year 2024, its budget was nearly $295 million, with over $160 million allocated to state library systems. Local libraries across the country rely on this support for digital literacy, workforce training, and internet access. Now, that brings us, of course, to today's feature segment. As organizations adapt to major gift reliance, donor churn, and increased public scrutiny, one question is becoming increasingly critical: how do we build meaningful relationships that last? Joining us now is someone who's leading the charge on donor engagement, Luis Diaz, founder of the Donor Participation Project and the Annual Fund Toolkit. Luis, welcome to Frontlines of Social Good. It's great to see you here.
Hi, Jay. What a pleasure and what an honor. Thanks for having me, and thanks for everybody who's with us today.
Well, it's good to see you and to see you in front of the big picture right there. But I know we're not talking about that data. We're talking about philanthropic data. Maybe I can throw a kind of a softball at you and start with the Fundraising Effectiveness Project, which I know is not your chief concern, but it does kind of frame the discussion. We see that fundraising dollars are up, but donor counts are down, especially among new and repeat donors. What do you make of this pattern?
Oh my goodness. That's a really good question. So, I mean, I don't think there's a lot to make, right? I think it's a fact. But also, I like to sometimes distinguish between what is a short-term trend. So what happened, is this a comparison from last year to this year? So Fundraising Effectiveness Project is incredible, but I find that people tend to always compare this quarter to last quarter. They're like the short-termism mentality in the interpretation of the data. The data has been going on for centuries. I know folks who are very deeply involved with FEP and the Giving Tuesday folks too. What kills me is the lack of attention to the long-term trend, which is, this is not because of the economy right now, because of the political cycle right now. There's something deeper going on. And that's what always kind of bugged me when I was a frontline fundraiser in schools and higher ed and some orchestras and things like that.
That's a great way to frame some of this discussion. And before we begin delving into the Donor Participation Project, which I know you designed to address some of these problems, can you talk a little bit about your own background, how you came to that project?
Oh my goodness. Musician, then with a business studies background. So I studied a lot and I ended up getting a PhD in business, but then I really wanted to be a musician. So kind of going back and forth, and eventually landed in fundraising almost by chance. So I just discovered the career. It's not something that in the country I grew up in that was something people did. It was the government that paid for things. So I discovered that as a career, and it kind of made everything come together in a beautiful way. So it was like, it's mission oriented, but it's also business related, and you can talk with people, but you can also be very technical and never talk with people. So it truly felt like a wonderful place to spend a lot of time in, and it's what eventually I did. Started career in higher education fundraising, mostly in the annual fund, depending on your listeners, Jay, but direct response type of fundraising, but then kind of transitioned into a little bit more major gifts, and then started Donor Participation Project during COVID, which is a wonderful group of people that meets every month. and we can talk about that later. But that kind of just led to, led down another rabbit hole, which brought me here today.
Well, no, let's jump into that right now. So what was the genesis of that? Why did you begin that project?
Well, Donor Participation Project came as a combination of both an opportunity, which was COVID, and everybody was at home, and we just had a lot of time, basically, but also a little bit of frustration, which around the fact that a lot of the way that we were looking at the data. So it's not that there's new data, like you just said, but I just felt that it was very short-term oriented. So, and even from like my supervisors and VPs and boards and chairs and all of those, it was always about like the last crisis. And I was saying, look, this is a multi-decade long trend. Like I had a background as an economist. This is not really about how hard you're working. So there are parts of fundraising that are harder than they used to be, like raising smaller gifts from lots of people. And there are other parts that are not, easier, but kind of have evolved into universities now don't only have major gifts, they have principal gifts. And then at some point they're going to have universal gifts. I don't know, Galaxian gifts. So, the way things are going. So, and that's kind of what I wanted to look at. And I wanted to get people together talking about these issues in different ways than what I was seeing. So I basically used COVID as an opportunity to say, let's get a group together over lunch once a month. And we started that, and it kind of grew and grew and grew. There's over 9,000 people signed up to the list now.
That's impressive in and of itself. But what was drawing them to it? What was the fire in their bellies that said they had to get together once a month? It wasn't just COVID. It was obviously the problem that was we're addressing collectively.
I mean, I hope it was that, or I just sent a lot of LinkedIn direct messages to my friends until they showed up. I think it's a combination of people were experiencing these same things in their day job, and they were saying, yes, but I'm not working any less hard than people that came before me, right? It's just fundraising has changed, and the work, or maybe some parts of fundraising have not changed, some have changed. I'll mention a few of those that I've discovered over time. And the world has changed. Like, people are listening to the same message differently. We're much more divisive. There's social media now. It used to be that you heard from your favorite nonprofits or your church through what they told you. Now that's not the case. You hear about them on social media and the press, all other places. So people were I think it was part of people were feeling that, and they wanted a place to discuss this, kind of a safe venue to discuss these issues, but also kind of in a non-judgmental way, which was part of our ethos from the very beginning, which is like, we're figuring this out together. If anybody knew the answers, they'd be living in an island in the Caribbean, and they'd be a very rich consultant. But obviously nobody has. So what can we do about this? So we try to give it a bit of a different approach than maybe other learning opportunities that were out there.
What kinds of questions were you asking? Were they asking? And how did you find a way to sort through all those questions? That's a major economic.
Well, it's very broad, but we tried to have a little bit more of a grassroots approach. I also gave it a little bit of my interest. So I would use the fact that we had a group of people to recruit very advanced, smart speakers. Our very first speaker was a researcher at Harvard Divinity School, and she had done this incredible case study on why some organizations were attracting millennials more than others. And kind of thinking about the decline in religious participation. She was trying to figure out the same problem that we were, which is, why aren't people showing up the way they used to? And one of the key learnings from that session was the importance of community. So she said, when we were doing this case study, we heard like the same refrain over and over. I came for the artistic self-expression. I came for the dinners. I came for the programming, but I stayed for the community because of the community. And so, we just tried to have an ear out, be thinking, practice active listening. And I invited all speakers to do very short presentations, and just let people ask questions after the fact. There's a combination, Jay. I don't know exactly what the answer is. Between all of those things I've mentioned, something kind of ticked. But it's also kind of a nice topic because we're never going to solve it. So, I mean, or at least we're going to keep learning. It's a very deep topic, right?
Yeah, well, definitely. I mean, on one level, just I'm thinking about the terms because I like definitions. When you say donor participation, at least what I think of automatically is, of course, donors participating as donors, but that's not
Yeah.
the only way that people participate in things. And you just talked about engagement in a different way, which is community. And I've seen those trends like you have, not just through my own experience and anecdotes, but through the literature. For decades, we can look at the demographics of these organizations and how they've declined, service organizations specifically. And in fact, there's almost a big growth and interest in talking to Robert Putnam again, I think, because of all this. So as you've looked through this, and especially working from the period of somewhat social or at least physical isolation in COVID to today, are there some key things that you've seen emerge as kind of learnings from the project that people have been able to take back to their offices and say, I can try this as a way to engage with people, not just to keep them as donors, which is really important, but also to make sure that they know that they're family, and we treat them as such?
That's a really good point. Actually, that very first session 5 years ago led me personally to do a lot of research on community building. And in everything I read, like also that's been what has built my consulting practice over time, which is I had the opportunity to learn about these problems and hear like threads of solutions from hundreds of people every week. And I tried to put that together, like what you're saying. So community building, I like this way of defining it, is when people get together in ways that are participatory, purposeful, recurring, and that identify leaders. And that comes from a book called Get Together, from a group that I think has since disbanded or sold, but they were involved with the Facebook groups when they started. Apparently, Facebook saw that groups were taking off, which were these closed groups of people in like a big chat, and had no idea why this was happening. And they set out to study what makes a strong community. And these were some of the learnings from that. But if you think about it, that's exactly what a board of trustees is. You know, they're participatory, they have a say, they're purposeful, they meet, and it's very clear what the purpose is. It's recurring. All, you know, these boards have recurring meetings, and they identify leaders, which is themselves or, you know, others, to do the work. So I found that to be, you know, that's one of the key learnings. I'd say another one is asking for the right things. So and that can be as simple as, what is the next ask for somebody that may not be financial? So you said, what does donor participation even mean? Well, we kept it broad on purpose because sometimes you want to ask somebody to volunteer, to give you their opinion. It can be a really low barrier ask. And we kind of seem obsessed with asking everybody for a gift, and maybe they're not ready for that. So or it may be we're asking for the wrong type of gift. And this is the big conversation about, why are we always asking for these small one-time gifts that come and go with the wind versus asking for monthly gifts, which just makes so much more sense financially and across every other metric you can think of. So, you know, there's a few other things that we've learned as we've gone along, but, you know, about trust building and things like that. But that's kind of in my back pocket now.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that strikes me about this is that some of those things are easily measured by in conventional terms, and other things maybe less so. How have you thought about the things that can be measured and those which can't, and how important is that? Either to sell the concept about building relationships in different ways, or to just perhaps change the way we view our work?
Well, Jay, you're a tough interviewer. That's a really good question. I'm of two minds with measurement. So on the one hand, you know, I went to business school, and you can't manage things that you can't measure, et cetera, all those sayings. And I mean, yes, and so the way that's true is that maybe we need to change the things that we're measuring or that get shared in board meetings. I have a really good example. the retention rate. So the retention rate is a good metric, but it's incomplete in an important way. You can be losing donors and your retention can be going up. If you have a core group of loyal donors and they're staying on with you, actually the fact that you're losing overall donors is improving your retention rate. So it can, it can lie to you. So I much prefer to look at a metric that's just number of loyal donors. So it's much easier to understand. So, do you have a group of people who have been giving to you for a while, however you define while, and is that number going up? Like sometimes, just keeping it super basic. So metrics, yes, they're good. But also maybe we need to, if we want to motivate different behaviors, we need to change the numbers that we're looking at. So we need to change the feedback loops.
And think about loyalty, which is a totally different thing. So as you've talked with others and done your own work, what are some of the ways that we can measure loyalty? What is it just frequency and recency? Is it the old stuff, or are there other ways we should be thinking about it?
Well, that's super easy to measure, which is, I say, okay, it's an imperfect measure. You're kind of just you have to draw the line in the sand somewhere, but actually just number of consecutive years of giving or frequency of giving within a specific time frame will tell you a lot. So that's one way to measure it. You could go bananas with this, right? So, and then you kind of turn this into a huge exercise of measuring everything you can and email engagement. But, frankly, for most shops and for most boards, I think just looking at that one number would be more, actionable. So part of this is, are we a little bit too obsessed on measuring everything? I have a great example about that, Jay. Yeah, versus acting on kind of some things that are self-evident. I mean, self-evident is a horrible word, but that are kind of true no matter how you measure it. For instance, there was during COVID a big push in universities and other nonprofit, every nonprofit to have a more diverse donor base. And we had a couple of sessions about this in Donor Participation Project. And what killed me was that people were saying, oh yeah, but we need to collect more data. Until we had a speaker that said, well, I mean, have you looked at your portfolios? Do they look diverse or do they not? Like who are you considering as potential major donors? And then are you doing something about that? And then people were like, oh no, but we need to measure more, and we have to be more careful, and the data is not all back, and it's hard because the database isn't fully updated. So that's a little bit of the counter trap to metrics and being very data oriented.
Yeah, letting I guess the old saw, perfection is the enemy of completion. It seems like there are a couple ways that nonprofits often go in fundraising, and one of them is, to overly generalize, one is just spray and pray. Where we're sending lots of material, and now digitally it's less expensive to do that, but we run the risk of alienating people. And then the other is, oh no, we have to be super careful, like you just described. And no, we have to do so much work before we do anything. I wonder if there's emerging a third way, that either the kinds of learnings that you've had personally, but also collectively through the project, or maybe through some of the technologies that have emerged just in the last 5 years since the beginning of the pandemic, if they're also contributing to kind of some new thinking on how we can build or at least observe loyalty, if not measure it.
I mean, and because of your institutional connection to DonorSearch, I mean, that's very clearly AI is a solution to this when used appropriately, right? And we ourselves are seeing many of those same things. Actually, we've started a software project, and I have a co-founder with this. His name is Chris Trainer, to build an AI tool for content generation and project management in fundraising, because, well, if writing is no longer the kind of the roadblock in doing this work, why can't we have double the amount of segments? Why can't we speak to each person individually? And I think many people are going to get there eventually where they're exploring these ideas because it's truly kind of a paradigm shift.
We talked about something right before we went live that I don't know how to weave it in here, but it's so important. I definitely want to ask you about it. And that's this idea that 80% of giving is going to the top nonprofits, and why. And I wonder if we're seeing that exacerbated, and if any of that is a result of what we do as opposed to just kind of natural phenomena. Can you talk about this a little bit? You said it so much more articulately before we started today.
No, Jay. I mean, I'm gonna blab my way through this idea, and hopefully between the two of us, we can shape it. But I read about this fact that actually, if you're thinking about the decline in donor participation, that's in the numbers giving to a relatively small number of nonprofits that were huge or are huge. So it's not a decline in everybody like across the board necessarily. So that was one idea. The other idea was we were working with a client that, I don't think this is a secret, but a United Way that, like all United Ways, has found challenges in the change of business model related to workplace giving. They have in some ways been disintermediated. So like for folks who don't know about this, people used to give to United Way at their workplace as a way to support their community. But since then, there have been some software platforms that came in and said, actually, Coca-Cola, don't do the United Way campaign. We'll help you manage your workplace giving. But that has meant that the huge decline in the number of donors to United Way. So, kind of the idea that we were discussing, Jay, is this partly like a structural issue, more than just kind of a problem of effort, right? So it's not a problem of effort or of not being persuasive enough or of not stewarding your donors enough, which is all the typical advice that you get. And finally, another way that there's a structural solution to this is monthly giving, right? So monthly giving, it just makes so much more sense under every metric that you look at. Donors who are monthly givers have higher retention rates. They tend to give for longer periods of time. They tend to give more. What's holding us back from fixing the structural changes that seem to be breaking and establishing new ways of giving and new habits of giving that seem to be much more stable and conducive to healthy nonprofits?
Well, so what is it? Why is that? I mean, if you gathered together 9,000 people, presumably they weren't all doing it right when you started, and plus they know others who I'm sure weren't doing it right, who weren't there with you. We know that monthly giving sometimes is as easy as changing the giving form online. To some degree. I mean, at least that's opening a pathway for people that they can make a decision that's not just, I give under your terms, but no, I'm giving under mine. And so why is it, now I'm asking you to change from economist to psychologist, but why is it that we don't do this? And are there if someone is listening and they think, well, what are the 3 things I need to do, or the 3 things I need to tell my boss that I need to do? What are those things that would help them to get over this psychological, if not technological, impasse to monthly giving?
Okay, so let's use monthly giving as an example. And actually, what we discovered in Donor Participation Project is that fundraisers were an incredibly innovative, hardworking group of people. And there were other reasons for which things didn't happen. So monthly giving, let's say, what happens if you want to switch to monthly gifts? First, the model for like subscriber giving, subscription model is very hard to maintain at the same time as a one-time giving model. So if you give people the option of either a one-time gift or a monthly gift, and on top of that, many nonprofits turn it on, but just default to one-time gifts, most people will choose one-time gifts. So the power of defaults is very important, which means that you either have to do additional campaigns, which is hard because people are overstretched, or switch everything to default to monthly. If you do that, then that's going to put stress on your gift processing systems. It's going to put stress on your cash flow because instead of getting $100,000 after the gala, you're now spreading this out regularly throughout the year. in the long term, you're going to come out ahead, but try to explain to this, to the board that's trying to, that's in the red this year, and needs some cash to come from somewhere. And then stewardship is going to change a little bit. Change is always hard. I hate to say it, Jay, but it ain't so easy.
All right, it's not easy, but clearly you think it's important. And we're not just talking about monthly giving now. We're talking about this whole concept of participation in whatever form it takes, but especially among the lion's share of donors who are right now, they have, at least statistically recently, kind of taken a step back. And you touched on trust. Trust may be a factor in this. Part of it is what we do and don't do, which you've been talking about. If you were to roll all this together, are there some, when you think about this, especially the last 5 years of this for yourself, if you were talking to people from another country, perhaps, where they could learn from the experiences, the good things and the bad things we've done, because philanthropy is growing globally, what are those key learnings that people should apply in order to jump past the chasms we've created for ourselves?
Okay, so let me leave you with 3 ideas to depart this. Trust building is possible in many different ways. One way to build trust is just to be around for a long time. So an organization has been around for 100 years. We trust it more than one that is just knocking at our door and we never heard about. But nonprofits can't control that. Among the ways to build trust that are most effective and you can actually do something about are, 1, providing value. And value is really a concept that can look like lots of different things, but the idea that the nonprofit has to be giving to the community in which it is sometimes a hard thing to swallow for some organizations still. So value can be informational resources, networking, emotional, which is kind of why those letters used to work, because there was some emotional journey there that they carried you through. All types. Some nonprofits give out bags, tote bags, and that's some type of value. So the idea that the nonprofit has to give value, that's one way to build trust. Another way to build trust is to build community. So basically just do stuff together with your people. Think like the Jim Langley puts this in beautiful terms, right? Of kind of the community and all that. Communities of purpose, he says. So those are basically the 2 best ways to build trust that I found. Give value, do things together. And then finally, when you do get around to asking, if you're starting from scratch, if you are doing those small dollar asks, get people into a plan that makes them first reflect on their philanthropy and then commit over time, like monthly giving. If it's larger gifts, there was this huge movement years ago, Jay, Benevon, some type of consulting. And when I read into it, I thought, well, maybe all of this, may still work or may not work, but actually it seems to me that what makes this tick was the 3-year pledge. So they were asking everybody for a 3-year pledge. And once you have somebody, people are more likely than not to keep doing it. So ask for the right things. So those are the 3 big takeaways.
Thank you, Louis. I know you're barely scratching the surface of what you've been doing for the last few years and what you've learned and all these people that you've worked with and helped. But if people want to learn more about this and participate in some way, how can they do that?
Oh my goodness, Jay. Well, first, before we do that, thank you so much to you, to DonorSearch, to everybody that's been involved in making today happen. I'm honored to join Donor Participation Project. It's very easy. You go to joindpp, so the initials, joindpp.org, and you sign up there. It's an email list. There's nothing hidden there. You just start getting invites for a monthly lunch and learn. That's about it.
Thank you so much, Louis. It's great to see you and learn from you today. Really appreciate it.
It's a pleasure, Jay. Thank you. Thanks, Jack.
And now, folks, we're going to move on, of course, into another dimension of this whole retention issue, and that's the staffing dimension. So while it's one thing, of course, and a very complicated one, as we heard, to try and retain our donors, retain the people who are really driven by the same kinds of principles and missions that we are, we also have to think about retaining our staff, especially at a time like this. Across the nonprofit sector, organizations are navigating high turnover, burnout, and a growing need to better support the people doing the work. For those who are watching and listening to this, You're probably working with or for a not-for-profit organization. You may see yourself in that description. To explore what's behind those trends and how to try and reverse some of the problems we've had with retaining staff, I spoke with Evan Wildstein, co-author of the Social Impact Staff Retention Study. We were originally also going to have his colleague, Michelle Flores-Brin, but unfortunately she is unable to be with us today due to family issues. But we look forward to welcoming her in the future. But we do have the opportunity to hear from Evan today in this recorded interview. We discuss what the data shows and what nonprofits can do to create more stable, supportive workplaces. Here is our conversation. Jack? So Evan, thank you for being here and being a part of the discussion today. It's great to have you on the program. I know we're going to talk about the Social Impact Staff Retention Study. It's a lot of words, it's a lot of things to share, but let's begin with you. Tell us a little bit about yourself and how you came to be involved in this project.
Sure. Inching into my mid-40s, I'm a Scorpio, Enneagram 8, not the things you were curious about, but I am now in my 22nd year of in-house nonprofit work. About half of that time was spent in public programs in arts and creative industries. The last half more grounded in fundraising, strategic operations, things like that, for all sorts of different organizations. I've been at statewide public policy advocacy shops, Rice University, trade organizations for arts or arts fields like opera and performing arts and things like that. And I now find myself as the head of advancement for a really wonderful, I would say small, but maybe mid-sized Montessori school here in Houston, which, as we were talking about before we officially went on, is a place that I think does what most missions ought to do, is be creating an environment where learners can continue learning. And I've loved this sector, as frustrating as it is at times, and that's part of the reason my co-conspirator and I dreamt up this survey project last year, which you can just call it Scissor. You don't have to social impact staff retention the whole time. We lovingly call it Scissor just to be cute and straightforward.
And we won't be running with scissors today, but we will be interrogating them a little bit. So that's a cute acronym. What inspired the project itself? And when did you start this back in 23, or was this later?
Yeah, and I would say a big hat tip to Michelle Flores-Brin, who is my co-pilot on this project. Michelle's got some of her own pretty big family stuff going on this week, and she's taking care of that, and we are grateful to let her do that. Michelle and I are both Texans by current nature, and so we have our paths have crossed now at the same time with some organizations we've worked with through and for. During COVID, we got connected via Zoom by a colleague who really loves introducing people. And we started dreaming things up about this conversation under the auspice of staff retention and staff well-being. Back in 2022, AFP Houston has a big conference that they do every year. They call it Ask the Experts, and they invited us to come speak on this notion that everyone felt in 2022. It's sort of the beginning of the tail end of the COVID pandemic, big stress. And nonprofit staff started getting very vocal, very loud about well-being and all those things. I do feel like that conversation came and went, and now we're sort of just back to the crud. But Michelle and I started dreaming what it would look like if we started paying literal attention to the field in asking a survey. So in probably late 2023, we dreamt up Scissor. We put it out to a few hundred nonprofiteers in the US, because it's, almost 13 million of us working in the US, and that's a pretty big sector to work on. And the first year findings for that we released in early 2024. So time being what it is, we collected the data late 23, released the first year's findings in 2024, and now we're a year later back at it. And it's been our practitioner brand of trying to figure out what irks and what ails nonprofiteers with no sales pitch at the end. I think there's a lot of consultancies and vendors out there that will do data collection like this. And at the end of it, they say, you've told us X, Y, and Z are wrong. Here's the bill for the services, and we can help you fix X, Y, and Z. Our goal is to give this information freely and readily as we can to anyone who wants to use it, especially boards and bosses. So if y'all are listening, go find the data and figure out what's tweaking your nonprofit the wrong way.
Yeah, at the risk of derailing the conversation, why the boards and bosses? Why is it so important to get this information into their hands?
If you had asked me this question a year ago, the answer would have been a little bit different. And one of the reasons Michelle and I have not yet released 2025 findings is that, as especially down here in the States, we know mid-January something very politically big happened. And following that decision, federal grant funds were put in a challenging position. People that worked in the public sector maybe moving over to our sector because there's going to be a whole lot of jobs available. So I say, you say boards bosses, I like to say decision makers. That could be department heads, that could be anyone, but really anyone who feels like they need a stronger pulse on what is underneath the issues of the nonprofit sector. For a long time, I had conversations with folks who say, we just need to pay people more. And whether you're a nonprofit or for-profit, the data consistently show that as long as people are paid adequately, it's usually not within the top 2 or 3 reasons why they're looking to leave. Last year it was number 3, that folks felt they had inadequate benefits and compensation. This year that bumped down to number 4. So we're not saying you can get away with paying poverty level wages if staff growth, workload equity, and things like that are in good shape. But people who are able to make decisions about staff retention, I say boards and bosses because CEOs, EDs, and board chairs have a big, big hand in this. But anyone who has people under them, they have independent contributors that report up to and work with them, you need to know how the field is faring. And those are the things that we always encourage people to look at.
And you kind of gave us a preview of one of the results. Before we dig into them, can you tell us who you surveyed, maybe even how many, but who you surveyed, and then what kinds of questions you asked?
Sure. The sample group last year was just shy of 300 people. This year it's just over 300 people. Michelle and I put this out all the places we could. LinkedIn, we have the folks at We Are For Good and other like podcasts put the word out. We collected it anonymously online, and we asked a series of questions identical from year 1 to year 2. Basically, the gist of it is, what corner of the nonprofit sector are you in? Are you in animal well-being? Are you in arts and culture, social health, et cetera, et cetera? What kind of work do you do? Are you in programs? Are you in marketing? Are you CEO, founder, fundraising, et cetera, et cetera? And then we get into the, are you looking for a new job? If so, why? Michelle's brilliant addition to this, in addition to other things, was saying, if you're not looking for a new job, also tell us why, because we don't just want to think that it's all on fire, there's nothing good. And what we found, if you want me to go into a little bit of a 2-year preview, is we looked comparatively at all industry averages of people who are looking for work. That's for-profit, not-profit, government, agriculture, everything. And what we found last year is that something like 65% of folks in all industries were looking for work. We were, in the social sector, just about 9 points higher than that. Round that down, it's about 7 in 10 nonprofiteers said they were looking for new work. This year, the all industry averages have shrunk a whole lot, anywhere from, and I have it here, 48 to 54% of people looking for new work, and we're at about 67% in the social sector. So again, if you round that, 7 in 10 people, both years, told us they're looking for new jobs. The reasons will be unsurprising for folks, and they were almost contiguous from 24 to 25. Both years, and this year that factor was a little bit worse, is that people have really glaringly bad workload equity. Too much to do, not enough support to get it done. I don't know a single nonprofiteer who wouldn't hear that and go, yep, I'm one person doing 1.25 people's jobs, 1.5 people's jobs. Under that, lacking growth opportunities. What often happens in the nonprofit sector is, to grow, you kind of bounce from organization to organization to grow in compensation, but also to grow in title. Last year, compensation was the 3rd issue. This year, it's 4th. But this year, the 3rd issue is just incompetent or not positive management and leadership. And I happen to have one of the world's greatest bosses now. Wasn't always the case in my career. Probably everyone listening would also shake their head. One of the surprises for me, and especially I know you mentioned that your audience here is deep in the philanthropy world, fundraisers, people who use technology to get at it, but it could just be that perhaps on the social media channels, fundraisers are their loudest, talking about the woes that we feel, and I'm technically in fundraising now. But when we look at the areas of nonprofit work that are most at risk for leaving, both years, marketing communications professionals were highest of the list of folks that were looking to leave. 81% of people this year. Fundraisers, 2/3 of them last year and this year told us that they were looking for new jobs. And that was actually third on the list under public programs. So we're loud. And I know the average tenure of a fundraiser seems to keep shrinking. I think it used to be 18 months. I've heard here in Houston that tenure is about 14 to 16 months now. And we sort of have the information of why people have told us that they're leaving. And so that's one of the things I would encourage those decision makers to do, to look at, for every one major gift officer, for every one director of development, look at their workload. Take out someone's job description, really go through that with a fine-tooth comb with them. Don't make that assumption by yourself. Job description shouldn't be 600 words, shouldn't be 3 pages. It shouldn't be the work plan for that fundraiser. Job description should be 6 to 8 core functional areas of work that you want someone to do, and then figure out if the work that they are doing above and beyond is moving the mission along. Because at a certain point, when people are in your charge, you've got to decide if cutting things from their plate, even if it's a beloved program, even if your board's going to want to hold a funeral for that program that they've just done forever, those things really require attention right now, because otherwise you'll have to keep posting expensive job hires, because that's how it goes.
There was something you mentioned in number 3 on that list that struck me. Incompetent, or what was the word? Not positive nor negative.
Yeah, I want to pull up exactly what it is here.
Because as you're doing that, I found that interesting, because those two things aren't always in the same pot. I mean, sometimes you have negative people who are highly competent. Sometimes you have really positive people who aren't. Deduce from that?
And of course, it could be a lack of sleep, but I'm not finding it here. But last year, that management issue, I think, was either 4th or 5th. So it's always been in that top few things. And my concern with the health of the sector, not really the fitness. I define organizational fitness as great social media presence, big budgets, those things that we think define healthy organizations. But what this field writ large tends to do worse than other fields. And part of it is just, I'm on this soapbox lately and I'm doing an event this week for it. Otherwise, is that I do think there's an issue of us doing it to ourselves, sort of like organizational Munchausen's, where people see bad managers and bad leaders because those folks, not necessarily through their own fault, but they're put in positions of influence and authority where that skill gap to be here is quite large. And organizations don't think enough about making available professional development funds or resources. Not all PD costs money, but it does cost time. If you want to say, go listen to Jay's podcast, I'm going to give you an hour a week to do that. We're going to flip your workload over to someone else to do it. That doesn't cost you anything, but it just costs you some mental energy. And often the great phone makers are put in charge of the phone makers, and that they don't have that skill. Lawrence Peter wrote a lot about this in the 70s, Peter Principle. And that's, for those who are listening who don't know, that was what sort of inspired the Dilbert cartoons. So all the crappy bosses that you see in the Dilbert cartoons were take their cue from Lawrence Peter's research, although it was meant to be a joke, I think, back in the 70s, but it's just turned into this thing. So bad managers are the ones who I think are put in roles that are a little outsized for them. And they were a great fundraiser, but now they're the director of development. They don't really have the skills, and the boards don't really think that they should make the space available because they don't know. It is this cycle.
I did want to ask you about something else. There's a general, I don't know if it's proverbial or what it is. Maybe it's just a cliche. People talk about major gift officers or development people only being in their jobs for 18 months, then moving on. And it's something I've repeated too, but I'm not sure that it's actually a statistic or it's just folklore. As you've been doing this work, have you gotten a sense about how much staff retention really is an issue? And if it is it, are you able to quantify it and say, well, what we're seeing is that people are moving on every 2 years in these kinds of roles and every 4 years in those kinds of roles? Is there any kind of consistency that you've been able to ascertain from this?
It's a good question. And, have Michelle and I back on the podcast in 3 years when we're at 5 years of data collection, because what we're trying to show is the reasons different industries and different pockets of nonprofit work are saying that they're looking. If you look at just the fundraiser data, it's almost identical to the reasons why they're looking to leave. Doesn't necessarily say that they are. These are the people who have an eye on, AFP Global or Idealist.org looking for new jobs, and they've told us the reasons. I know a lot of fundraisers here in Houston and around the world who stay in their jobs a long time, and I could have a very narrow view because I'm talking with people who generally think like I do, that they know what it takes to be a great contributor to a team. They know what it takes to be a great listener and someone who can guide a team and manage a team and garden a team to growing. The challenge becomes, and the fundraisers especially, I think it was Penelope Burke that did this research not that long ago that talked about the hard and soft costs to an organization when a fundraiser leaves, because you got to post that position, you've got to have a vacancy for an X amount of time, you've got to quantify and qualify the relationship that walks out the door with the gift officer, the director of development, whatever it is. And she has said, I could be wrong, so don't quote me here, but I think it was something like close to $1 million direct and indirect costs to an organization over 3 years when a fundraiser leaves. How remarkable if that data point was actually accurate, but it's still high, whatever the number is. So every organization is going to look differently. If you take arts and culture as a field, for instance, I worked at a great organization here in Houston, Houston Grand Opera. It's the job that brought me from New York City to Houston. The fundraisers at Houston Grand Opera have been there a long time. Their chief development officer has been there a long time. He's a great guy. I know people who have been in their jobs there 10, 12, 15 plus years. Yet, in our data, we find arts and culture, 92% of people who are arts and culture employees are looking for new work. That data point is huge. And what I have seen, because I spent the first half of my career in arts and culture, is you have a lot of that Peter principle in that field. You have great museum curators, you have great dancers, you have great, insert art form here, and then they get plucked and put into a management position with very little landing strip, but a whole big budget to accomplish. And that will just drive people away. But on the fundraising side, if, hold me to it, if these issues are met, if you can really work with people on what their workload looks like, if you can talk with them about other duties as assigned being something that is mutually beneficial, it's not just the organization saying you've got 3 hours of slack in your schedule, we're going to fill it with 3 hours of things we need. It's you've got 3 hours of slack in your schedule. What's an interesting project that you are keen to do and that might grow your skill set, that we can look at job description X and say, here are 1 or 2 things on that job description you're not currently doing. As another duty to assign to you, we want you to dream up what it looks like for your professional growth. I had a great HR colleague tell me that once, that we look at other duties as assigned the completely wrong way. In the social sector, we look at it from our organizational needs, not the potential in our staff. I got way away from your question, but I think these are some of the things we can do when we look at organizations, and boards should look at that. What is the tenure? What's the exit rate of our fundraising staff, of our marketing staff, of our program staff? And the answer can really no longer be, well, they just stick around for 18 months, so let's get out of them what we can. There's always something that can be done. And if you can extend that 18 months to 2 years, 3 years, that could be 5 years. Very few people are in the job they're going to conclude their career in today, but we can work at that.
So it's less important whether it's 18 or 24, 36 months than it is retaining people who are really contributing to the organization and doing the things that you need to keep them there.
Yeah, and that we are filling their cup as
Right.
well. Not one of the things we found this year, there was a new response that we had people opt into. One of the top reasons that people said they're staying in their work is that they have good alignment with the mission. We might assume that, but if you flip that around to the people who are leaving, unalignment or in alignment with the mission is the penultimate response on the bottom end. So it wasn't that they were disillusioned with the mission and that's making them leave. And it doesn't necessarily mean that just because they love pets, that's why they're staying, an animal service organization. So we have to always keep in mind that everyone is exiting the forest of our organizations. It could be at the conclusion of their career in 30 years, or it could be in 3 months. But if you've got a lot of those 3-month exits, that's either you're hiring practices are just way stuck in the 80s or 90s, or there's something else that we're not looking at.
So maybe a last demographic question. It's a little mixed up, but I'm sure you'll be able to untangle it for me. Were you able to tell from what you've studied so far if there are big differences in terms of the demographics of the people answering, especially because we're talking about diversity a lot in the last few years, and particularly at this moment, but for very specific reasons now. But the influence of the difficulty within organizations, is different for different kinds of people. And so, are you seeing differences in the way people engage with their employment according to their own, own cohorts, their own backgrounds? And the same is true. And then also kind of a related question, is that true from sector to sector? You mentioned the arts. And is it different for folks, generally speaking, in the arts from, let's say, higher education or social services?
So on the first part of the question, and I wish I had printed out the right thing, but listeners in about a week or so can go and check it out. We're not breaking down, and part of this is intentional. We've not broken down any kind of diversity metrics. What we're getting into is the scale and scope of the work that they do. Now, on the podcast that I do with my colleague Tasha Van Vlek up in Canada, we had a great colleague of mine, his name is Jonah Nye, come on, who talked openly about issues of race and boundaries and things like that. And he's the head of fundraising for the Juilliard School, which is a big deal job. And Jonah was the head of fundraising at the New School and a lot of the Jewish Museum in New York City. And one of the things that he planted home is, if people see themselves in the leadership teams, there's a greater propensity to stay. There are data out there that can speak to this better than we can. We intentionally keep our survey short and quick so we get the maximum amount of responses. We may change that over time. But there is not a grand flux if you were to look at, like, say, distill the data down, arts and culture, social services, education, things like that. Everything averages out pretty centrally. The big glaring thing is just always, regardless of the field, that the marketing comms folks are the ones who are looking for jobs highly, and folks in arts and culture are the ones who are looking for jobs highly. Everything out kind of levels out at that either 6 or 7 out of 10 people.
Yeah. So what has surprised you most about this, at least in the most recent iteration? What's really jumping out?
There are some positives. I would say the number of people, or the response rate for folks who said that they're looking because of poor compensation or benefits, that's dropped by almost 10 percentage points. And so that can indicate a couple things. I do think nonprofits are finally swinging around to the idea that poverty wages, just because someone loves the mission, they won't stick around. We've seen that in the data. We've seen that in our own organizations. So I think that's opportunistic. The rate of people looking dropped from 74 to 67%. That also mirrors the all industry averages, and nonprofits are still many percentage points higher. But this whole industry is, I'm about to hire for 2 roles in my organization, and I'm a little excited, but also mostly terrified at what the market is going to look like for fundraisers. Are we going to have a flux of ex-government employees who did public sector work that are going to be coming here? What is it going to mean for the quality of the candidates? We're going into a really weird, wonky, murky job market, and that's for people who are looking and people who are hiring. But I guess we will wait and see.
If people want to get a copy of this report, it's coming up very soon. How can they do that?
Yeah, we have the infographic, which is a great, quick 1-page view for you to take to your next board meeting at thenonprofiteers.com/CISR or SISR. And the full report for last year and the infographic are up there, and before too long, you'll see the full report for this year. And there's a way for you could sign up, and we don't spam emails. We really just once or twice a year send you where we are and the invitation to next year's. But thenonprofiteers.com/SISR, best place.
And I know you, of course, you've named Michelle, your co-author in all this. We'll make sure that she's mentioned in our show notes. But for people who want to also listen to what you do on the podcast, how can they listen to that?
Oh yeah, that's great. Goodnonsense.org. The show is called Good Nonsense because it's good sense in the nonprofit space, and we have a lot of people who are just aggressively honest with us on that show. Each episode's about 30 minutes, very quick to listen to. They're pretty funny, And it's real talk, which is always nice.
Thanks so much for all this, Evan. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
My thanks again to both Luis Diaz and to Evan Wolstein for being on the program today and for their aggressive honesty. I appreciate it very much. Before we close today, here's what's coming up next in the Philanthropy Mastermind series. On April 4th, in the PM podcast, we will hear from Chris and Rebecca Van Bergen of Nest, the nonprofit working to build a more inclusive and global economy for handworkers. In this conversation, they reflect not only the mission of Nest, but also on their personal journey as married partners navigating leadership, family, and global impact together. It's a rare look at the human side of social enterprise, and I think you'll enjoy it. You can catch that wherever you get your podcasts, as well as on the DonorSearch YouTube channel. Then on April 8th, we'll be live with Frontlines of Social Good, this show, where our focus is purpose-driven board leadership. We'll have Jean Takagi, principal of Neo Law Group, and Patton McDowell, author of Your Path to Nonprofit Leadership, joining us to talk about how boards can lead with clarity and intention, especially in times of change. And on April 10th, we return with How to Raise, our CFRE accredited series. Our guest then is Jen Newmeyer, Senior Director of Digital Fundraising Strategy at PBS. She'll introduce a reimagined model for digital fundraising that's designed for today's landscape, integrating donor journeys, leadership structure, and organizational culture. And of course, you can pick up your CFRE credits with that show. To register for these and all upcoming sessions, just visit the website of our sponsor, DonorSearch, the leader in responsible AI and donor research solutions for the nonprofit fundraising world, at DonorSearch.net. Thanks for spending time with us today. We'll see you next time on Frontlines of Social Good. Till then, take care.